In the medieval world, most cities grew powerful by controlling land. Baghdad grew powerful by staying open. Goods passed through it. Ideas paused inside it. Money changed hands without stopping. For centuries, this openness made Baghdad indispensable. Merchants crossed continents assuming the city would be there, functioning, predictable, profitable. That assumption created enormous wealth, and it quietly tied the city's fate to events it could not control. Baghdad did not rise by accident. It was placed deliberately along the Tigris River, where overland routes from Central Asia met river traffic and maritime trade from the Persian Gulf. A caravan arriving from the east could unload goods that would be moving south by water within days. Movement overlapped here. Caravans, ships, and barges converged not because they were forced to, but because coordination was easier in Baghdad than almost anywhere else. Information traveled with cargo. Prices adjusted quickly. Deals closed faster because everyone expected others to show up. Connectivity turned location into advantage. The city did not need to dominate territory aggressively. It benefited from motion itself. Baghdad's prosperity did not come from rare events. It came from repetition. Every day grain moved in, textiles moved out, spices passed through, silver circulated. Merchants did not need to renegotiate trust constantly. Customs were familiar, weights were recognized, contracts were understood. That predictability allowed trade to scale. Wealth accumulated not through hoarding, but through flow. The more traffic passed through Baghdad, the more reliable it appeared. And the more reliable it appeared, the more traffic it attracted. A virtuous cycle, as long as nothing interrupted it. The Abbasid state did not try to replace these trade networks. It organized around them. Unlike land-based empires that taxed fields, Baghdad taxed movement. Revenue was collected at ports, markets, and checkpoints. Income rose when goods moved smoothly, not when territory expanded. This mattered. The state did not need to micromanage production far from the capital. As long as routes stayed open, revenue arrived steadily. Administration adapted to circulation rather than controlling it. Power followed commerce, not the other way around. Baghdad's wealth felt durable because it did not rely on a single route. If one corridor slowed, another often compensated. Diversity of connections softened shocks. Trade did not stop easily, it rerouted. The city did not demand constant attention to function. Its systems rewarded continuity. Merchants returned because previous journeys had worked. Stability emerged from habit, and habits, once formed, rarely feel fragile until they break. Over time, connectivity stopped being treated as a condition. It became an expectation. Trade would arrive, routes would stay open, distant partners would remain reliable. Baghdad adjusted its scale to that belief. Urban life, elite wealth, and state revenue increasingly depended on movement continuing without major interruption. Openness stopped being a choice. It became the foundation and a potential single point of failure. So what happens when a city built on movement meets a world that suddenly stops moving? If you're the kind of person who likes seeing how systems, not just battles and rulers, quietly shape history, then this is the kind of story we tell here. If that sounds like you, consider subscribing. Prosperity did not just enrich Baghdad, it reset expectations. Merchants planned routes assuming Baghdad would function smoothly. Credit deals were written assuming its markets would clear on time. Tax revenues were projected on the belief that caravans and ships would keep arriving. Wealth stopped being a bonus. It became a requirement. A single season of disrupted trade could leave treasuries short and food prices unstable. What once felt like abundance now felt like obligation. The city had to stay open to stay solvent. Baghdad's elites did not simply benefit from trade, they organized their power around it. Merchant families invested in caravans that crossed continents. Urban landlords depended on rents paid from commercial profit. Scholars, judges, and administrators relied on stipends funded by taxes on exchange. Their influence rose and fell with circulation. Protecting caravans mattered more than protecting farmers. Maintaining routes mattered more than diversifying production. Stability came to mean continuity of movement, not balance. Prosperity narrowed priorities. The Abbasid state adapted quickly. It did not need tight control over distant land if goods passed through Baghdad. Customs duties, market taxes, and transit fees generated steady income without expanding administration outward. Revenue arrived because movement arrived. Officials focused on river ports, city gates, and marketplaces. Fiscal planning assumed trade would compensate for weakness elsewhere. Dependence was written into how the state worked. Baghdad expanded because it expected trade to continue. Food was imported. Luxury crafts flourished. Labor specialized because essentials arrived through exchange rather than local production. This made the city vibrant and exposed. A city built for constant flow struggles when flow pauses. Baghdad was no longer sized for interruption. Scale increased reliance. Dependence deepened as credit spread. Merchants financed journeys months in advance. Contracts assumed predictable arrivals. A delayed caravan in Central Asia could leave traders in Baghdad unable to meet obligations long after the cause was forgotten. Credit made distance manageable. It also made delay contagious. Problems no longer stayed local. They traveled along the same routes that once carried wealth. Interconnection turned shocks into shared risks. None of this felt dangerous at first. Markets still cleared. Taxes still arrived. Baghdad looked indispensable because it was indispensable. That was the illusion. The city mistook how much others relied on it for how much control it had. Centrality reduced flexibility. Adjustment became harder because too many livelihoods depended on continuity. Prosperity discouraged preparation for disruption. By the time risks became visible, choices were narrow. Closing routes meant collapsing revenue. Restricting trade threatened elite interests. Slowing movement destabilized urban life. Openness was no longer a policy. It was an obligation. Baghdad depended on a world staying connected, even as that world grew less predictable. So what happens when a city built on connection becomes exposed to every disruption in a connected world? Baghdad's openness had once softened shocks. Now it carried them directly into the city. A conflict in Central Asia could delay caravans long before anyone in Baghdad knew why. A dispute along the Persian Gulf could slow shipments that fed entire neighborhoods weeks later. Distance no longer buffered disruption. It delivered it. The same routes that once diluted risk now transmitted it faster than the city could respond. Openness stopped filtering uncertainty. It amplified it. Trade routes crossed more than deserts and seas. They crossed power. As Abbasid authority fragmented, the routes Baghdad relied on passed through rival courts and unstable territories. Tolls shifted without warning. Security varied by region. Agreements made in one year unraveled the next. Baghdad depended on roads it did not rule. Exposure increased not because trade ended, but because control was scattered. The city coordinated movement, but could not guarantee it. War did not need to reach Baghdad to damage it. Armies upstream seized ports, disrupted roads, and frightened caravans into delay. Merchants waited. Warehouses filled slowly. Prices crept upward before shortages appeared. Baghdad felt war as hesitation, not destruction. The system depended on confidence, on the assumption that goods would arrive soon enough to justify credit in contracts. Conflict eroded that confidence quietly. The flow slowed before it broke. Disruption did not hit everyone at once. Luxury goods vanished first, then specialized inputs, then everyday items. Crafts stalled before officials noticed. Families tightened belts before administrators revised tax records. Because the city was specialized, it lacked buffers. Temporary adjustments followed. More credit, tighter margins, delayed payments. These fixes worked briefly. Then they hardened into habits. Temporary fixes became routines. Baghdad relied on partners it could not discipline. Merchants followed profit, not policy. Regional rulers answered to local interests. Climate, conflict, and politics shaped outcomes far beyond the city's reach. Baghdad carried the risk without carrying the power. Decisions made elsewhere now determined stability at the center. Exposure grew because dependence ran outward, beyond any single authority. As political unity weakened, alternatives disappeared. Where once multiple routes compensated for disruption, now fewer paths remained reliable. When one failed, there was no easy substitute. Where there had been options, there were now bottlenecks. Exposure increased not because trade stopped, but because choice vanished. Markets once sent clear signals. Now they blurred. Merchants could not tell if a price spike meant scarcity or rumor. Was a delay temporary or systemic? Administrators reacted late. Credit tightened cautiously, then defensively. Uncertainty fed on itself. When signals lose clarity, coordination slows and hesitation spreads. Baghdad remained connected. But it was no longer insulated. The same networks that once brought stability now carried disruption faster than institutions could adapt. Exposure rose not from failure, but from reliance on systems the city did not govern. Wealth pulled the world inward, and risk followed. So what happens when a city built on connection meets disruptions it can neither control nor redirect? Baghdad did not suddenly become poor. Markets were still busy. Coins still circulated, goods still arrived, but the city no longer felt predictable. Caravans came late without warning. Prices shifted for reasons no one could clearly explain. Merchants hesitated before committing capital that once moved freely. Wealth remained visible. Stability did not. Baghdad had been built for continuity, for the assumption that trade would arrive tomorrow as it had yesterday. Fragility emerged the moment that assumption could no longer be trusted. The city still looked rich, but it had lost its margin for disruption. Baghdad's great advantage had always been integration. Trade routes overlapped. Markets communicated, credit linked distant partners. That integration once softened shocks, now it spread them. A disruption on one route no longer stayed local. A conflict far away delayed supplies, unsettled contracts, and altered prices across the city weeks later. Baghdad was brilliant at moving goods and unprepared for containing failure. When something went wrong, it did not stop. It traveled as Abbasid authority weakened, coordination fractured, protection varied by region. Agreements became temporary. Enforcement depended on who controlled a road that year. Some routes were safe one season and dangerous the next. Baghdad still depended on the network, but the network no longer depended on Baghdad. Importance no longer guaranteed cooperation. Exposure increased not because the city lost relevance, but because relevance no longer ensured alignment. When Mongol forces reached Baghdad in 1258, the city was already exposed. The invasion was devastating, but it was not the source of fragility. It was the moment fragility became undeniable. A resilient, well-buffered system might have absorbed the shock and rebuilt. This one could not. The same connections that once sustained Baghdad collapsed all at once. Trade routes failed together. Trust vanished together. The city still had wealth. It no longer had resilience. Earlier disruptions had passed. This one did not. Merchants scattered. Records were destroyed. Credit relationships dissolved. The people who knew how to coordinate trade, finance, and administration were gone. Rebuilding required confidence across the same networks that had failed. But confidence does not return on command. A system built on connection cannot be restarted from a single place. Baghdad did not decline because it was open. It declined because openness became dependence. Connectivity created prosperity. Prosperity reshaped the city around continuity. Continuity reduced tolerance for disruption. When disruption arrived, it traveled faster than protection. Connectivity created prosperity. Prosperity created dependence. Dependence created exposure. And exposure turned wealth into risk. If you're the kind of person who likes seeing how systems, not just battles and rulers, quietly shape history, then this is the kind of story we tell here. If that sounds like you, like the video and subscribe. Baghdad did not fall because it was weak. It fell because a system built to connect the world could not survive when that world stopped moving together.